In our last lecture, we looked at the blood covenant of Genesis 15, where God passed through the animals alone while Abraham slept, which really clearly demonstrated for us that God's promises rest only on his guarantee and not on Abraham or any human's performance. So now in this video, as we step into Genesis chapter 16 through 22, we're going to see kind of the climax of Abraham's story in Genesis 22. When many people read these chapters, especially the famous sacrifice of Isaac on Mount Moriah in Genesis 22, they can reduce the story to a simple moral test about obedience. Well, hear questions like, are you willing to give up what you love the most? Or how obedient are you going to be when God asks to get you to give everything? But when we read these chapters through the design of the book of Genesis and we read them with a theological lens, we see that there's something far deeper going on. So over the course of this lecture, we're going to reframe that story. We're going to see how Abraham stumbles through decades of anxiety and manipulation before finally arriving at this faith that in many ways is logical, but takes him years to develop. And it moves this story from a narrative about moral obedience to a theology of trust in God's faithfulness. Before we arrive in Genesis 22, we have to look honestly at how Abraham behaves between Genesis 12 and Genesis 20. Again, often in Sunday school, there's these stories about Abraham that paint him as almost like a flawless giant of faith. We read Hebrews chapter 11, and maybe we think only about Abraham as a man of faith. But the text of Genesis doesn't hide his human reality at all. In fact, it highlights a lot of major instances where Abraham tries to, quote unquote, save or manage the promise through human manipulation. So, first of all, in Genesis 12, immediately after receiving God's promise, we get the scene where Abraham goes to Egypt and he fears for his life during a famine. He doesn't trust God to provide for him during that famine, even though God has just said he would receive that promise. And in order to protect his life, Abraham claims that Sarah is his sister. And he lies basically to keep himself safe instead of trusting God's promise that was just given to him. And then in Genesis 16, Sarah can't have children, and so they come up with a plan. Well, if we're going to receive a promise, I need a child. Otherwise, we can't be a great nation. So Abraham takes Hagar and one tries to produce an heir with her, taking matters into his own hands again and creating generations of conflict from this one choice. And then, honestly, it seems somewhat stupidly, after Genesis 15, a renewal of the covenant, another renewal of the covenant in Genesis 20, many promises have been given to Abraham. He's received word over and over again that these things will happen. He again repeats the exact same lie that he said to save himself in Egypt, but this time in a different place. He lies and says that Sarah is his sister. Notice the tension here. Abraham believes God's promise. He does. He definitely believes that he's going to get what God promises it. But he almost assumes like he has to engineer and protect the outcome. He doesn't seem like he trusts God to fulfill it on his own. It feels like maybe he needs to help. Yet through every misstep, the promise survives. Why? Because, as we saw, the covenant is preserved not by Abraham's flawless behavior, but by God's total faithful commitment to that promise. The struggle between human doubt and divine promise reaches a really interesting point in Genesis chapter 18. 3 heavenly visitors arrive at Abraham's tent, and Abraham recognizes that these are divine messengers. Many theologians would identify this as a Christophany. At least one of these figures here would be considered to be probably a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, renewing the divine promise that Sarah is going to bear a son within a year. Overhearing this inside the tent, Sarah laughs. And there are different ways to take this, but I don't think this is a laugh of joy that some people might say. It seems that it's a laugh of doubt, almost certainly. And you can understand her perspective. She's nearly 90 years old. She's way past the age of being able to bear children. And to any human's ears, the idea that she will carry a baby and an infant is absurd, maybe even cruel. So her laughter's like sheer raw disbelief, which is understandable. But when the miraculous child is born in Genesis 21, God instructs them to name him Isaac. which in Hebrew, Yitzhak, means literally he laughs or laughter. So think about the intentional brilliance of the name, at least from a literary perspective. Every single time Abraham or Sarah call out, Isaac, come here, they're reminded of that moment of laughter in doubt, but how it collided with God's unstoppable faithfulness and led to something that is true and an undeserved gift for them. Which brings us to Genesis chapter 22. I mentioned before the dramatic climax of Abraham's life of faith on Mount Moriah. So God calls out to Abraham and gives him an unbelievable command. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. So how do we interpret this moment? The most common moralistic view asks, does Abraham love God more than he loves his child? Or is Abraham willing to obey blindly no matter how tragic the command is? And if we apply these to ourselves, what do I maybe love more than God? How far am I willing to go for God? But if we read Genesis 22 in its literary and theological context, these kind of moralistic questions, we'll see that they miss the point entirely. Remember that God had explicitly told that the covenant, the nation, that blessing that he promised to Abraham would come specifically through Isaac. So Mount Moriah is not a test of affection or submission. It asks a really important question. Abraham, do you trust me to keep my promises, even when the circumstance looks completely impossible? As you read Genesis 22, if you read it carefully, you notice that um, the text drops subtle literary cues that reveal Abraham's inner posture and understanding as he ascends the mountain. I'm just going to draw up one of them for us now. Look at Genesis 22:5. When they arrive at the base of the mountain, Abraham turns to his young servants and says, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we will come back to you. Notice that plural pronoun there. We will come back to you. For a long time, commentators brushed this off as kind of a polite lie, assuming Abraham, he was just trying to make sure his servants didn't get too worried about what was about to happen to Isaac. And so he just tells them a white little lie so that they don't get worried. But in light of everything that we've seen in this book so far, we know that it's not a deception. It's a calm, deliberate statement of what Abraham expects. He fully believes that when the worship on the mountain is over, that both he and Isaac will walk back down that mountain together. And that is actually what happens. But how can we know for sure that Abraham believed that Isaac would return? Because even apart from the story itself in the Old Testament, when we turn to the New Testament, it interprets this text for us. When we look at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19, the author of Hebrews writes, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead. So let's look at the theological design at work in Abraham's mind, if we understand what the text in Hebrews chapter 11 is saying. Think about it this way. God promised unconditionally that Isaac is going to be the line through which the seed comes, through which his promise happens. It will definitely be through Isaac, not through anyone else, not through Ishmael or another son or an adopted son or an heir. It will be through Isaac. And then God commands that Isaac be offered on the altar. So Abraham figures at this point, God can't lie or break his covenant. So therefore, if Isaac dies on the stone, there's no covenant, like those promises won't come to be. So if God is telling me to do this, and Isaac is the child through which the promise is to come, then God's going to resurrect Isaac. He's going to bring him back. So Abraham's willingness to raise the knife was not just irrational, unthinking obedience. It was in some ways just pure theological logic. He thinks about what God has promised, and in this case, he believes. Instead of taking it into his own hands this time, he steps forward in faith, believing that for God to keep his promises, he's going to deliver Isaac somehow, even if that's by raising him from the dead. So when we look at this slide, it summarizes this equation pretty cleanly. God's unbreakable promise plus God's direct command equals inevitable resurrection. This is Abraham's way of thinking. So do you see what's changed in Abraham? For decades in Egypt, with Hagar, with Abimelech, Abraham's always trying to save God's promise through some kind of manipulation or panic, and he feels like he needs to do something. But here in Genesis 22, Abraham finally stops trying to manipulate the outcome, and he places the entire burden of the fulfillment of this promise onto God's character. He says to himself, if Isaac dies, God will raise him up because God swore an oath to me. So when the angel of the Lord stops Abraham's hand and provides this ram as a substitute, Isaac is spared. But as Hebrews 11 notes about this, figuratively speaking, Abraham did receive Isaac back from the dead. In Abraham's heart, the resurrection had already occurred before the knife was even lifted, and God did provide. So let's contrast the two ways of reading Genesis 22 side by side. If we read it with a moral lens, the core question is, are you obedient enough? Are you willing to do anything for God? The focus centers on Abraham's painful sacrifice. The lesson demands that you give up whatever you love the most and you go as far as you possibly can. And then Isaac is basically just viewed as kind of a tragic test piece in this divine exam of Abraham. But if we read this theologically, with a theological lens, the lens of biblical narrative, the core question is, do you trust God to keep his promises? Do you trust God to be faithful? The primary focus shifts from Abraham's willpower to God's absolute faithfulness. And so the lesson invites us to rest in that unconditional covenant. And Isaac is recognized as this almost invincible conduit through which God's redemptive plan moves forward because God has protected him with his promise. So this shift changes how we understand the entire narrative arc of the patriarchs. If we just look at their lives and always see how we need to be better, more faithful, we're missing the point, because the point is about who God is, his faithfulness, and what he is doing to protect his promises. So beware of this false check. If you evaluate your spiritual walk by constantly asking, am I good enough? Am I sacrificing enough? You're making the covenant depend on your own performance. You're falling right back into Abraham's trap that we see early in his life. Instead, Genesis 22 represents this true check that we need to live in. Are you living every day in quiet, restful confidence that God will be faithful to his promises to you? His promise of full justification in Jesus, his promise of the Holy Spirit to guide and seal you, his promise that nothing can separate you from his love. Christian faith is not some kind of agonizing self-effort to keep God happy. It's stepping out in logical, restful trust that God cannot fail his word. It believes that God is faithful. And this is what we see in Genesis chapter 22. So to wrap up our study of Abraham, let's look at this final summary. Abraham's life demonstrates two distinct postures for navigating God's promises. The first part, early in his life and through most of the Abraham narrative, is anxious intervention, where we assume that the burden of the outcome, to get what we want, we need to rely on human schemes and live in constant fear that God's plan will fail if we don't fix it. Or restful trust, where we place the burden entirely on God's character, walking in bold, logical obedience because we know that he will provide. The choice is very obvious. Now, it's not easy to live this way, but by reading the Bible and understanding it theologically, we get encouragements constantly to view our lives this way and to rest in the promise of God, secured through the death and resurrection of Jesus for us.